On a Tuesday in August of 1988, Elara Vance dragged the 12th sun-bleached cattle hide onto her tarp-covered stack in Cherry County, Nebraska. Harlan Briggs, the county renderer with 23 years. She did not answer him. That was the first thing anybody in Cherry County would tell you about Elara Vance, though most of them told it later, after they had reason to. When Harlan Briggs spat that brown thread of tobacco juice into the dust near her boots and told her the sun had cooked the grain right out of every hide on her stack, she did not turn around, and she did not defend the pile, and she did not tell him he was wrong. She reached down, took hold of the corner of the 12th hide, and pulled it flat against the tarp so the edge lay straight, the way a person straightens something they intend to keep. Briggs stood there a moment with his silver pocket knife, flipping it open and shut, waiting for her to argue. When she didn't, he laughed once, short and easy, tucked the knife into his clean blue denim shirt and walked back to his truck. He was 54 years old and he had rendered dead stock in that county for 23 years, and he had earned every hour of the certainty he carried. He was decent. He was also wrong, and it would take him a full year to learn it. It was August of 1988, and the whole of the Nebraska sandhills had gone the color of a paper bag. Let me tell you about that summer, because you need to understand what the drought did to Cherry County before you can understand why a stack of ruined hides looked like anything at all. The rains had quit in April. By June, the windmills were pulling up sand-flecked water, and the range grass had cured on the stem, brown and brittle, before it ever had a chance to grow. Ponds Elara had watered stock at her whole life became cracked gray plates, and the cattle, the big black cattle that were the only thing Cherry County had ever really made, began to die. 2,000 of them died on the Vance Range that year. Elara counted them. She counted them because her father had taught her to count everything, and because there was no one else to do it, and because a number, once you have it, is a thing you can hold on to when nothing else will hold still. 2,000 head out of a herd that had taken 3 generations to build. At the price cattle were fetching that autumn, with every rancher in 5 states dumping stock they could not feed onto the same collapsing market, the Vances came out of the summer $120,000 in debt. She was 28. Wiry, 5'7", with her sun-bleached blonde hair pulled back in the same simple braid she'd worn since she was a girl, and pale blue eyes that had a way of resting on a thing longer than most people found comfortable. She wore faded denim overalls and scuffed brown work boots and a brass key on a leather cord around her neck, and she moved with the slight forward stoop that comes to people who have spent their lives lifting things heavier than they are. On her left wrist there was a small crescent-shaped birthmark, pale against the pink sunburn, and across her nose a scatter of freckles the summer had brought out hard. Most people, when 2,000 of their cattle die, see 2,000 carcasses to be dragged off and rendered for tallow at 8 cents a pound. That is the correct reading. That is what the renderer sees, what the banker sees, what the neighbor sees. Warren Vance saw it too when it happened. But Warren Vance had also taught his daughter a way of looking at things that did not stop at the obvious, and he had done it without ever meaning to teach her anything at all. Warren was 58 that summer, broad through the shoulders, 6'1", with silver-gray hair cropped close and gray eyes under heavy brows, and a deep dimple on his left cheek that had not been given much use in a long while. He wore red and black plaid flannel over a white t-shirt and khaki work pants, and in his shirt pocket he carried a brass pocket watch on a chain that had belonged to his own father. He stood the way a man stands who has spent 30 years in the military of hard weather, straight-backed, taking the measure of the sky before he took the measure of anything else. And the thing he had said to Elara, over and over, all through her growing up, without ever knowing it would become the spine of her whole life, was this: a thing you paid for is the only thing they can't take away. He meant it about the ranch. He meant it about the tools in the shop, the fence he'd strung himself, the well he'd sunk with his own back. He meant that debt was a hand at your throat and a paid-for thing was a wall at your back, and he had built his entire caution around that one sentence. Elara had heard it so many times it had stopped being words and become the way she saw. And what she saw, that August, when the rest of the county saw carcasses, was hides. 2,000 hides, sun-bleached, cracked, refused by every renderer in the region, and therefore free. Free. That was the part nobody could get past. The reason those hides were worthless was written across the surface of every one of them, plain as print. When a hide dries in the open under a sandhill sun, the grain layer, the tight outer skin where all the strength and all the value of leather lives, dries faster than the flesh beneath it. It shrinks. And where it shrinks unevenly, it cracks, a fine web of fissures you can see if you tilt the hide against the light. A cracked grain is a ruined hide. Any tanner in the country will tell you so. Bacterial rot had gotten into some of them too, gray-green blooms along the flesh side where the sun hadn't reached. Harlan Briggs had looked at them and priced them below the cost of the salt it would take to haul them, and he was not being cruel and he was not even being careless. He was being right, according to everything he knew. But there was something Harlan Briggs did not know, and something Warren Vance did not yet know, and something not one person in Cherry County had any reason to suspect. For 2 years in the evenings after the stock was fed and the accounts were done, Alara Vance had been reading a book. She had bought it for $1. It was at a farm auction over near Valentine, in a cardboard box of paperbacks and old seed catalogs that went as one lot, and she had bid on the box for a hydraulic manual she wanted and gotten the rest for nothing. The book was called Unconventional Hide Processing, printed sometime in the 50s by a press that no longer existed, written by a man whose name meant nothing to anyone. It was water-stained and the spine was broken and half the diagrams were smudged. And it made a claim, buried in the 3rd chapter, that no working tanner of the modern day would have wasted breath repeating. The claim was this: that a hide dried slowly and evenly under sustained heat, sun-bleached rather than kiln-dried, did not simply crack and spoil. Under the cracking, if the drying had been slow enough, the collagen fibers of the grain contracted and locked into a tighter, denser weave than a fresh hide ever achieved. The surface looked destroyed. The structure underneath, if you knew how to unlock it and set it, could take a tan finer and stronger and more supple than ordinary stock, with a character no tannery could reproduce on purpose. The trouble, the book said plainly, was that the process to recover it was slow, precise, and unforgiving, and that 99 hides out of 100 that looked salvageable were in fact simply ruined. You had to be able to read the cracks. You had to know which web meant locked fiber and which web meant dead skin, and the difference was a matter of how the fissures ran and how deep they cut, and the book gave you the way to tell. Alara had spent 2 years learning to read them, not because she had planned for 2,000 cattle to die. Because the book was interesting, and because reading it in the lamplight was a way of being somewhere other than a range that was drying up around her, and because her father had raised her to believe that the difference between worthless and valuable was very often just a question of who was doing the looking. She had practiced on the odd carcass, on hides she'd bought for $1 off other outfits on scraps. She had a notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing with a bent cover, and it was 3/4 full of her own small handwriting, salt ratios and soak times and failures before the drought ever came. So when the drought came, and the cattle died and Harlan Briggs priced the hides below the salt, Alara did not see carcasses. She saw 2 years of quiet reading finally meeting the thing it had been reading for. That evening she sat at the kitchen table under the hanging bulb and wrote it all out in numbers, because numbers were the only language that would move her father, and because she believed in them herself. She had gathered and salted 12 hides so far, and there were closer to 900 sound enough to try for on the range. Her recovery cost, she wrote, was labor and transport only, diesel to run the range dragging carcasses to the shade of the cottonwood draw, her own hours which she priced honestly rather than pretend they were free. Salt she already had. The vats she would build from stock tanks that were sitting empty because there was no water to put in them. Materials, in the sense of anything she would have to buy that she did not already own, came to zero. The manual was $1, 2 years spent, all in, to recover and hold the hides while she worked out whether the thing was real, $1,200, against a debt of $120,000. She set the ledger on the table where her father would sit for breakfast, squared it to the edge, and went to bed. She did not leave a note. Warren Vance did not respond to notes. He responded to figures laid out clean, and he responded to them in his own time. He came in from the barn before light, poured his coffee, and sat down. The dawn had not gotten as far as the window yet. He put on the reading glasses he kept in his flannel pocket beside the pocket watch, and he pulled the ledger toward him across the oilcloth, and he began, very slowly, to read what his daughter had written down. He read the recovery cost first, $1,200. His face did not change. He had spent a life reading figures, and he read these the way he read a sky, without hurry and without giving anything away. He ran his thumb down the column of hours she had charged herself, and he saw that she had not cheated the number to make it look better. And something in the set of his shoulders eased a quarter of an inch. Because a person who charges themselves honest wages in a ledger meant for someone else is a person who is not trying to fool anybody, least of all themselves. Then he turned the page and found the part that was not arithmetic. Her explanation. In her own hand, plainer than the diagrams in the book, she had written what the manual claimed and why she believed it and what she thought it was worth if it was true. And here Warren Vance stopped and lifted his coffee and did not drink it, and sat looking at his daughter's handwriting in the gray light with the cup halfway to his mouth, the steam going up past the dimple in his cheek. Because the claim on the page was the exact opposite of everything 23 years of Harlan Briggs and 30 years of Warren Vance and 3 generations of Cherry County cattle knew to be true. It said the ruin was the value. It said the thing that had cooked the grain out of every hide was the same thing that could make them worth more than sound hides ever were, if a person had spent 2 years learning to tell one kind of cracking from another. And his daughter had apparently spent those 2 years in the evenings at this table without saying a word to him about it. He set the coffee down without having drunk from it. "Alara," he said when she came in with the milk. He did not look up from the page. "This isn't ranching." She stopped in the doorway with the pail in her hand. "This is gambling," he said, and there was no anger in it. Warren Vance did not raise his voice at figures and he did not raise it at his daughter. He said it the way he might have said the ground was dry, as a fact he did not like and could not change by disliking. He had watched neighbors gamble. He had watched them borrow against next year to expand this year, and he had watched next year turn on them, and he had said the same word over their empty places at the co-op afterward. Gambling. It was the worst thing he knew how to call a plan. Alara set the pail on the counter. She did not argue. She had known, writing the ledger the night before, exactly which word he would reach for, and she had decided that the only answer to it was the ledger itself. "Read the last column, Dad," she said. That was all. Then she went out to see to the chickens. The last column was not the recovery cost and it was not the explanation. It was her estimate of what a single recovered hide, tanned true, might bring from a specialty house. She had written a range, honest at both ends, the low and the high, and beside it she had written the number of sound hides on the range, and she had done the multiplication and left it there without comment, the way you leave a loaded thing on a table and step back. Warren Vance sat alone at the table with the dawn finally reaching the window and read that number twice. Then he read it a third time. The coffee had gone cold in the cup, and the steam had stopped rising, and out in the yard he could hear his daughter talking low to the chickens the way she'd done since she was small, and he sat with the ledger open in front of him, and did the one thing that had kept the Vance Ranch in Vance hands through droughts and price collapses and the deaths of 2,000 cattle in a single summer. He did nothing. He did not say yes and he did not say no. He read every line of it again from the top, the recovery cost, the salt ratios she'd copied out of the book, the soak times, the market range, the multiplication left standing at the bottom, and he weighed it the way he weighed everything slowly against the sentence he had lived his whole life by, that a thing you paid for is the only thing they can't take away. The hides were paid for. That was the piece that would not leave him alone. They had cost him 2,000 cattle, which was to say they had cost him everything, and there was no more debt to be had against them because they were already lost. Whatever his daughter did with those hides, she could not lose them twice. That was the part Harlan Briggs, pricing them below the salt, had never once considered, and it was the part Warren Vance now turned over and over in the cold morning like a stone he was deciding whether to keep. He got up finally and washed the untouched coffee down the sink and put his reading glasses back in his flannel pocket beside the watch. He did not take the ledger with him. He left it open on the table, squared to the edge exactly as she had left it for him, and when Alara came back in from the chickens, he was standing at the door with his black work boots on and his hat in his hand. "I need to think about it," he said. Then he went out to the range, where 2,000 of his cattle had died, and left her alone in the kitchen with the open ledger and the cold light coming through the window. Let me tell you what those 2 days were like, because the waiting is a part of this story that nobody who wasn't in that house could ever quite measure. Warren Vance did not think out loud. He did not talk it through at supper, or ask her questions across the table, or give her any sign at all which way the weighing was going. He went out in the mornings and worked the range as if there were still a herd on it, mending fence that fenced nothing now, and he came in at dark and ate what she cooked and read the weather section of the paper and went to bed. And Alara did not ask him. She had known better than to ask him since she was a girl. Warren Vance granted permission the way the Sandhills gave rain in his own season, and pushing him only pushed the season further off. But she did not sit idle either, and this was the thing she had learned from him without either of them ever saying so. On the second day, while her father was out on the range deciding, Alara walked the shade of the cottonwood draw with her cheap spiral notebook, and she read the cracks on every one of the 900 hides she thought might be sound. Not to move them. She had promised nothing yet and been promised nothing. But to know, if the yes came, exactly what she had. She tilted each hide against the low sun and traced the web of fissures with her freckled thumb, sorting in her mind the two kinds of cracking the book had taught her to tell apart. The shallow, bright web that meant locked fiber and the deep, dead cut that meant rot had gotten under the grain. She marked her count in the notebook. Of the 900 she'd hoped for, 640 read true. She was on her knees in the draw with a hide tilted to the light when her father found her. He had come up quiet, the way he did, and he stood over her a while watching her thumb move along the cracks, watching her write a figure in the bent cover notebook. And she did not stop for him, and she did not look up, because she had learned that too, that you answer Warren Vance by continuing to work and not by turning around. He watched her sort 3 more hides. Then he crouched down beside her on his heels, which was a thing his knees did not like anymore and which he did anyway, and he picked up a hide she had set on the yes pile and turned it in his big hands and looked at the web of cracks she said meant strength. "Show me," he said. "Which is the good crack and which is the bad?" So she showed him. She took the hide out of his hands and tilted it and ran his own thumb along the shallow, bright fissures, the way you'd guide a child's hand across letters, and then she found him a bad one, a deep gray cut with the rot blooming under it, and had him feel the difference, the one firm under the pressure of his thumb and the other giving, spongy, dead. She did not lecture him. She just moved his hand where the difference was and let him feel it, and Warren Vance, who had rendered his own dead stock for 30 years and never once thought to look this close, felt with his own thumb the thing the book had promised, that ruin and value could wear the same face and be told apart by a person who had spent 2 years learning how. He stood up slow, and his knees cracked louder than the hide. "Use only the hides that are already on the ground," he said, looking out over the draw, not at her. "You don't drag in one carcass more than the drought already gave you. I won't have you making this cost us cattle we've still got standing." There were 111 head left alive on the whole ranch. He was drawing a line around them. "No new loss," she said. "I know, and I'll want a receipt." He said it the way she had known he would because she was his daughter and she had already written the same words in the ledger before he ever said them out loud. "Every dollar you spend on this, I want to see the paper for it. Salt, lumber, whatever you burn, a receipt." "I'll need a receipt for every dollar spent," she said, at the same moment nearly, and he glanced at her sideways, and the dimple in his left cheek came out for the first time in that whole burnt summer, just for a second, and went back in. Then he told her the rest of it, and this was the part that had taken him 2 days, the part he had walked the dead range to be sure he could say. "If it fails," Warren Vance said, and now he did look at her straight, the gray eyes level under the heavy brows, "if you put your time and my salt and this ground into it and it comes out the other end worthless the way every hand in this county says it will, then we sell the ranch. Not because I'll blame you. Because there won't be another way to carry the debt, and I'd rather we choose the buyer standing up than have the bank choose one for us on our knees. You understand me, this is the last thing we try, there's nothing behind it." She understood him. She was 28 years old and her father had just handed her the whole weight of 3 generations and told her that if her quarter book and her 2 years of evenings were wrong, the Vances would be off the land her great-grandfather had proved up. She understood him exactly. "All right," she said, and that was the permission. There was no ceremony to it, no handshake, no speech. He'd said his condition and his warning, and she'd said the one thing back that told him she'd heard. And then Warren Vance walked out of the cottonwood draw toward the barn to see to the 111 head that were all they had left, and left his daughter kneeling among 640 ruined hides that were now, whatever else they were, hers to try. It was August still when she started, and the heat lay on the sandhills like a hand, and she began the way the manual said to begin, which was with the hides themselves, one at a time, on the ground. The granary was where she set up because the granary was empty. There'd been no grain to store in a year that grew none, and it stood dry and shaded with a plank floor and good high walls. and Alara swept it out and hauled in the 2 empty stock tanks that would be her soaking vats. She dragged the first hides in from the draw on a stone boat behind the tractor, and then the work that would fill her days for the rest of that year began, and it was slow, and it was hard on the hands, and it was exactly the work the book had warned would break most people before the process ever had a chance to. First, she shook each hide out in the yard to knock the sand and grit loose, and then she trimmed it. This was the part her thumb had been reading for. She laid each hide flesh side up across a table she'd knocked together from barn lumber, and she went along the edges with a knife cutting away the parts the rot had taken, the spongy gray margins where the salt of a dead animal in a dry heat had not been enough to stop the bacteria. Sometimes she lost a quarter of a hide to the knife. Sometimes she lost more, and set the whole thing aside for tallow after all, because reading the cracks in the draw was one thing and reading them under the granary light with the hide flat and clean was another, more honest thing, and some of the hides that had read true in the sun read false on the table. She did not argue with the false ones. She trimmed them out and moved on. Her father's condition ran under everything she did. No new loss, so the only loss she'd allow was the loss she cut away herself cleanly and counted and wrote down. The grain integrity test was the thing she did last before a hide earned its place in the vat. She'd take a trimmed hide by one corner and bend that corner back on itself, sharp, watching the crack web where it folded. A hide with locked fiber underneath would fold, and the surface web would open a little and close again clean when she let go, the way a fist opens and closes. A hide that was truly dead would fold and the crack would run, would travel out from the fold like a windshield giving way, and that hide was finished, no matter how good it had looked in the draw. She bent every corner of every hide before she committed it. It was slow. There was no faster way and she did not look for one. Then the soaking. And here is where the trouble started, because the book gave a method and a range, but the book had been written by a man in another climate with other water, and the granary of a drought year ranch in Cherry County was not the world that book had been written in. Her first vat of hides she oversoaked. She'd read the manual's soak time and taken it as gospel and left the hides the full stretch it named, and when she pulled the first one and stretched it over the drying rack, it came out wrong. Not rotten, brittle. Stiff and glassy, the grain gone hard as shellac, and when she flexed it, it did not fold at all. It simply cracked straight through. The locked fiber the sun had made now locked so hard the water and salt had turned it to something like horn. She stood in the granary with the ruined hide in her hands and her heart going, because this was hide number 1 of the real attempt, and she had done everything the book said and it had failed. She did not throw it. She sat down on an upturned bucket and got out the bent cover notebook, and she wrote down exactly what she'd done, the soak time to the hour, the salt she'd put in the water, the temperature of the granary as near as she could guess it. And then she thought about it, alone, the way her father thought about things. And she reasoned it through. The book's water had been colder. Cold water works slower. Her granary was holding the day's heat well into the night, and the warm water had driven the salt into the grain faster and further than the book's cold water ever would, and she had left it in the whole cold water time and turned the fiber to horn. The failure had a cause. The cause had a fix. She wrote the fix as a question because she did not yet know the answer, only the direction of it, less time or less salt or both, and which. She fixed the time first. She adjusted her water and cut the soak, and she raised her ratio to 8.7 gallons of water per hide, so the salt would have more to move through before it reached the grain, more room, a gentler road in. And she ran a second small batch, 3 hides, watching them close, pulling one early to check. And the second batch did not go brittle. The second batch grew a bloom. She pulled a hide on the second morning and found the flesh side gone slick and sour smelling, a gray-green haze spreading along it, and she knew that smell from the draw and from every dead thing a dry summer makes, and it was rot. Bacterial growth, come up in the warm water she'd thinned to save the grain. She'd cut the salt's road to the fiber, exactly as she'd meant to, and in doing it she'd cut the salt below what it took to hold the rot down. She had solved the brittleness and bought herself the very spoilage that had made the hides worthless to Harlan Briggs in the first place. She stood in the granary between the 2 failures, the brittle one drying hard as a board on the rack behind her and the sour one dripping in her hands, and for the first time since the ledger she felt the whole thing swing under her like a floor. Too much salt turned it to horn, too little let it rot. Somewhere between horn and rot there was a number, one exact number of pounds of salt against 8.7 gallons of water, that would hold the fiber and kill the bloom both at once. And the book gave a figure, but the book's climate had lied to her twice now. And she was going to have to find her own number, in her own granary, one ruined hide at a time, with 638 tries left, and her father's ranch riding on getting it right before the debt or the drought took the choice away. She carried the sour hide out to the tallow pile in the dark. Then she came back in, lit the lamp, sat down on the upturned bucket, and opened the notebook to a clean page. The number she was hunting for was 3.1 pounds of salt to 8.7 gallons of water, and she did not find it on the 4th hide or the 14th. She found it on the 9th day of trying, after a run of hides that came out horn and a run that came out sour and a stretch in the middle where she thought she'd bracketed it and hadn't. She'd been raising and lowering the salt by a 1/4 pound at a time, one hide to a vat so she could read each result clean, and she'd written every one down, the salt to the 1/10 of a pound, the soak time to the hour, the smell of the water when she pulled it, the way the grain took the bend. And on the 9th day she pulled a hide that did neither wrong thing. It came off the rack supple. It came off the rack the color of strong tea, the grain closed, and even the crack web she'd read in the draw gone quiet and locked and clean. She held it up to the granary light and she could see the fiber had held. Then she folded it. She took a corner and she bent it back on itself, sharp 90 degrees, the test that had run every dead hide off her table in a spreading crack, and she watched the fold. The crack web opened along the bend the width of a hair, and when she let go, it closed. It folded clean at 90 degrees and it came back, and she folded it again, and it did not run and it did not travel and it did not give. The hide held. She sat down on the upturned bucket with the hide across her knees, and she did not whoop and she did not run to the house. She got the notebook and she wrote the number down. 3.1 pounds, 8.7 gallons. She wrote it 3 times so she could not lose it, once on that page, once on the inside of the cover, and once on a scrap she folded into the tin where she kept the receipts. Then she sat a while longer in the granary with the good hide over her knees and let herself feel, just for that one evening, the thing she'd been holding off since August. It might work. It might actually work. But a hide that folded true in her granary was worth exactly nothing until a man who bought hides for a living agreed that it was worth something. And Alara Vance knew, the way her father knew things, that the hardest part was not the tanning. The hardest part was getting anyone in the trade to look at a drought hide twice. She started with the phone. She had a short list she'd built out of the back pages of the quarter book. Tanneries that the author said still took specialty grain, hand houses that made harness and saddle skirting, and the kind of leather that had to last a lifetime. And she called them one at a time from the kitchen phone with the ledger open in front of her and her father not in the room, because this was hers to do. The first one she reached, she got as far as the words drought hide, and the man on the other end was already talking over her. Unusable grain, he said, sun-checked stock. He'd bought a lot of it once, years back, off a Kansas outfit that swore it was sound, and it had cracked in the finishing and he'd eaten the loss and he wasn't doing it again and he was sorry for her trouble, but the answer was no. She thanked him and hung up and wrote it in the notebook. No, unusable grain. The second call went nearly the same. The third man laughed, not cruel, just tired, and told her that everybody with a dead herd in a dry year thought they'd figured out how to sell the hides, and none of them ever had, and he wished her luck she wasn't going to have. 7 times she made that call, and 7 times a man who'd bought hides longer than she'd been alive told her the same thing in his own words, that a sun-checked hide was a ruined hide, that the grain was gone, that it could not be done. She wrote all 7 down. She did not argue with any of them because she had learned that you do not answer a man's 19 years with a 28-year-old certainty over a phone line. You answer it with the hide. The 8th call was the Massachusetts house. She'd saved it because it was the one the manual named directly, the one the author said had taken his own unconventional stock when no one else would, and she'd been half afraid to spend it, the way you save the last match. The man who took her call let her finish. That was the first difference. She said drought hide and he did not talk over her, and she said the name of the book and the name of the man who wrote it. And there was a pause on the line, and then he said in a flat New England voice that he'd known the fellow, that the fellow was dead now some years, and that if she truly worked his method and not just read about it, he'd look at a sample before he told her no. He would not promise past that, but he would look. Send 3, he said, standard cuts, tell me exactly what you did to them. So she prepared the samples the way a person prepares the only thing standing between them and losing the ranch. She took 3 of her best hides, 3 that had folded true at 90 and held, and she cut from the prime of each a clean rectangle, 12 inches by 18, square-cornered and true, because the manual said a buyer read the cut as much as the leather, that a ragged sample said ragged work. She cut them on the barn lumber table with a straight edge and a fresh blade, and she trimmed the edges clean, and then she wrote out the processing notes by hand on a card for each one. The soak time. The salt ratio, 3.1 pounds to 8.7 gallons, which was hers now and no books. The trim, the grain integrity test, the fold at 90. She wrote it plain and complete, the way she'd want it written if she were the one deciding, and she paper-clipped a card to each sample and rolled the three of them together and boxed them. The parcel post window in town weighed the box and told her the cost. $42.75. It was a great deal of money in a house with 111 head left alive, and she thought about it standing at the counter, and then she thought about the last column of the ledger, and she paid it and got the receipt because her father wanted a receipt for every dollar, and this was $1, 42 of them and 75 cents besides. That was the night the doubt got into her. She'd held it off through 9 days of ruined hides and 7 telephone rejections, but it came for her that night the way it comes for everyone, alone in the dark, with the thing already done and out of her hands and nothing left to do but wait. She lay in her bed in the house she might lose, and she listened to the wind come off the sandhills, and she thought about the 7 men. 7 of them. Everyone had bought hides longer than she had been alive, and everyone had said the same word, unusable, and who was she? A girl with a quarter book and 2 years of evenings and a granary full of dead cattle. What if they were right? What if the 8th man opened her careful box and read her careful cards and folded her careful sample and watched the grain run and picked up the phone and told her the same thing the other 7 had told her, gently, because there was no way to say it that wasn't gentle. Unusable. And then Warren Vance would sell the ranch, standing up, the way he'd said, because there'd be no other way to carry the debt, and it would be because his daughter had believed a dead man's book over 7 living men who did this for a living. She lay there with that until very late. Her father found her at the kitchen table before dawn with the ledger open and the coffee not yet made, and he did not ask her what was wrong because he knew, and he did not tell her it would be fine, because he did not know that and would not say a thing he didn't know. He sat down across from her and pulled the ledger around and read the last column, the one she'd written back in August, the range, the count, the multiplication left standing. He read it a while, then he squared it back to her and said the only thing he had. Ledger shows a profit if one of them says yes. That was all. He did not say one of them would. He said the arithmetic was sound if one did, which was a different and more honest comfort, and it was the truest thing anybody could have told her, and she took it and folded it up and carried it out the next morning to mail the samples she had already boxed and paid to send. Then there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting is its own labor, and Alara Vance did not do it idle. 2 months the Massachusetts house had her samples, 2 months where the box might have been sitting on a shelf or in a bin or already tossed, 2 months where every day the phone did not ring was a day the answer might be no by silence. She did not call to ask. Her father did not call to ask. And so she did what he had taught her by living it, which was that you answer the waiting the way you answer the doubter, by continuing to work, and she worked on the ranch. There was fence down all across the north sections, drift fence the Drought's dead cattle had leaned through and knocked flat, and she mended it, post by post, stretching wire in the September heat, and then the October cool, splicing where she could and setting new posts where she had to, working the 111 head that were left into better ground. She repaired the granary roof where a summer storm had lifted a corner of tin. She patched the corral. She kept the vats going, too, quietly, running her 3.1 number through more of the 640, until she had a growing stack of tanned hides drying under the granary rafters whether anyone ever bought them or not, because a thing half done was worth nothing and a thing finished was at least finished. She was up on the granary roof laying a patch of tin when she heard the phone ring in the house, faint, across the yard. She got down off the roof faster than was wise and crossed the yard and got to the phone on the 5th or 6th ring, out of breath, and it was the flat New England voice, and it did not waste itself on greeting. He said her name to be sure he had her. Then he said the thing that she would remember word for the rest of her life, the thing that turned 2 years of evenings and 9 days of ruined hides and $42.75 into something real. Your hides, he said, have a grain structure I have not seen in 20 years in this trade. He said it flat, without wonder, the way a man states a measurement, and that flatness was what made her believe it, because a man selling her something would have dressed it up and this man was buying. He'd folded her sample at 90 and it held. He'd wet flexed it and it held. He'd finished a scrap of it on his own bench and the grain had taken the tallow even and closed, and there was no check in it, none. And he did not understand it and he did not need to, because he could sell every square foot of leather that hide would make to the harness and saddle men who paid the most and complained the loudest, and he wanted them. All of them, however many she had. She stood in the kitchen with the receiver against her ear and made herself hold steady and asked him how many he meant and what he'd pay, and he told her. $36 a hide, for sound hides, tanned true as her samples, delivered. And she knew from the notebook, right at 2,000 hides she could put through the process across that first push in the winter, the 640 of the best plus the more she'd read true as she went, and he'd take the run. $36 a hide against 2,000 hides. She did the number in her head before he'd finished the sentence, the way her father did numbers, and it came to $72,000, and she did not say it out loud into the phone because it did not seem like a number that belonged to a house with 111 head left alive. She said she'd want it in writing and a deposit against the first delivery, because she was Warren Vance's daughter and he'd taught her that a price on the phone was weather and a price on paper was ground, and the man said of course that he'd expect nothing less, and that he'd have the terms in the mail that week. Then she thanked him plainly and hung up and stood in the quiet kitchen a moment with her hand still on the phone. She did not run out to the range to tell her father. She got the ledger. She sat down at the table where he'd read her arithmetic back in the dark of August, and told her one of them saying yes would make it profit, and she opened to a clean line, and she did the accounting the way it had to be done before it could be called anything at all. $72,000, the gross, 36 times 2,000. From it she took the recovery cost, the $1,200 it had cost in labor and diesel and hire to drag the hides in off the range and out of the draws back in the summer, the money her father had let her spend before he'd let her spend anything else. From it she took the shipping, the $42.75 she'd paid at the parcel post window and gotten a receipt for because he wanted a receipt for every dollar. She subtracted them clean, no rounding, because rounding was a small lie and her father did not keep small lies in the ledger. 72,000 less 1,200 less 42.75, and the figure that stood at the bottom of the line when she was done was $70,757.25. She looked at it. She did not celebrate it. Celebrating was for people who weren't sure yet, and she was sure now. The paper was coming and the deposit would clear or it wouldn't, and the arithmetic was the arithmetic. She wrote the figure once in her plain hand, $70,757.25, and under it she wrote the date, and then she capped the pen and closed the ledger and went out to the range to find her father, not to whoop the number at him, but to tell him it had come, that one of them had said yes, and that the arithmetic he'd trusted had held. She wrote $70,757.25 into the ledger, and then, when the deposit had cleared the bank in town and the terms were signed and there was no more chance of it being weather, she started spending against it carefully, the way a person spends money they have been taught they might lose. She did not buy new, she bought what would earn its keep and no more. The Massachusetts house wanted volume now, wanted the whole run tanned true and delivered through the winter, and she could not run 2,000 hides through 2 stock tanks and a barn lumber table with a kitchen knife. So she ordered a hide scraper, a proper one, a fleshing machine off a used equipment list, and it cost her $320.50, and she got the receipt. And she ordered new vats, real tanning vats to replace the stock tanks, 2 of them, and they came to $521.80 together. And she got that receipt too, and she wrote them both into the ledger under the $70,757, because her father wanted a receipt for every dollar, and she found she wanted it too now, wanted the paper trail as clean going out as it was coming in. The county heard about it the way the county heard about everything, at the feed store, at the co-op, over coffee, and the county did not believe it. A girl who'd lost her whole herd had turned around and sold the dead hides for more than the live cattle would have brought in a good year, and that was not a thing that happened, and so it had not happened, and there had to be another explanation. Must be a scam, they said at the feed store. Somebody was going to take that Vance girl for everything the Drought had left her, some out-of-state outfit that take her hides and never pay, or worse, some paper game she didn't understand that'd end with the ranch gone after all. They said it with concern, most of them, because they were not unkind people. They were people who had watched the dry year break their neighbors and could not fit a girl beating it into what they knew. $72,000 for Drought hides. It was easier to believe a con than to believe the thing they'd all called worthless had been worth that all along, sitting in the draws, if a person only knew how to look at it. It was near the middle of a raw December morning, with the first of the tanned run boxed and gone east and the new vats steaming in the granary, that a clean gray sedan came up the ranch road slow and stopped in the yard where a truck had spat tobacco juice near her boots 4 months before. Ilara was at the granary door in her overalls with her braid coming loose from the day's work, and she watched him get out. Harlan Briggs. 54 years old, soft-bodied, his thinning brown hair combed careful over the top of his head, dressed in a clean blue denim work shirt and clean jeans and brown leather shoes that had never seen a corral. And he came across the gravel toward her not the way he'd come before, not with the hands on his hips and the forward lean and the parts counter certainty, but slow with his hat off already, held down against his leg in both hands, turning the brim. He stopped a good 10 feet from her, farther than a man stops who's sure of his welcome, and he stood there in the cold with his hat in his hands and looked at her. And the asymmetric eyebrows that always gave him away were pulled level for once with the effort of what he'd driven out to do. He stood there a long moment, and Ilara let him, because she'd learned from her father that you don't rescue a man from the thing he came to say. The silver pocket knife was in his hand, and his thumb worked it open and shut, the way it did when he was thinking, and then he seemed to catch himself doing it and folded it away into his pocket and left his hand out of the fight. He looked at the granary behind her, the steam coming off the new vats through the cracked door, the stack of tanned hides he could see hanging in the dark under the rafters, and whatever he'd built up to say on the drive out went past him and he came out with the plain thing instead. I was wrong. 3 words. He did not decorate them. He did not say I was wrong, and he did not say I was wrong, though anybody would have, and he did not reach for the story about the Kansas outfit that had cracked in the finishing and cost some man a loss, though it was surely sitting right there in his mouth wanting out. He said the 3 words and then he stood in the cold and took what they cost him, which Ilara could see was a great deal, because a man does not spend 19 years behind a parts counter learning what can and cannot be done and then drive out to a girl's ranch to say it out loud lightly. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her that wanted to. She'd used up whatever wanting to she'd had on 7 telephone calls and 9 days of ruined hides and 1 long night in a bed in a house she might lose. She just nodded once and said, it held at 90. Grain took the tallow even and closed, not to rub it in. To give him the reason because he was a man who lived on reasons, and she thought he'd rather have the reason than the mercy. He asked if he could see it. She took him into the granary and showed him the vats and the fleshing machine and the run drying under the rafters, and she pulled one down and folded it at 90 in front of him, and let him take it in his own soft hands and try it himself. And he wet his thumb and ran it across the grain and looked for the check that his whole life told him had to be there. And it was not there, and she watched him not find it. He handed it back and did not say anything for a while. Then he asked what she meant to do come the run's end, when the Massachusetts house had its 2,000, and she told him she didn't know yet, that she'd read more hides true than the 640, that there were near 2,000 in it if she got through the winter, and that after that there'd still be dead cattle in draws all across the county whenever a dry year came, and dead cattle every year regardless, at the packing plants, hides going for pennies because nobody knew how to read the sun-checked ones true. He turned that over. He was a buyer by trade and a buyer by nature, and she watched the trade come back up in him under the shame, watched him start almost against his will to see the thing the way she saw it. There were hides. Somebody had to buy them, grade them, price them, move them. He knew every rancher and every packing man in 3 counties by first name. He'd been reading hides across a counter for 19 years, and the only thing he'd been wrong about was 1 number, 1 word, 1 line in the book, and now that line was corrected, he knew everything else that mattered. She did not offer him anything that day. She let him drive off with the correction in him and no more. He came back in the spring in '89, when the run east was done and the check had cleared, and the ledger showed the 70,757 standing clean at the bottom, and he came back to ask for work. Not to buy in, not to partner, just to buy hides for her on wage, because she was going to need somebody who could stand at a packing dock and read a hide fast and pay right and not get taken, and there was no man in 3 counties better at it than the man who'd been wrong once and knew exactly why. She hired him. Harlan Briggs, first full-time hide buyer for a business that had a name now, painted on the granary in her own hand, Vance Hide Works, and he was good, the way she'd known he'd be. Because a man who's been humbled by one number is careful with all the rest of them for the rest of his life. And it was Harlan, that first summer of '89, who brought her the hides nobody would touch. Packing plant hides with real grain damage, 30% of the surface sun-checked and scarred, brand-blotched warble hold, the kind the regular tanneries wouldn't quote on at any price. He'd near thrown them out of his own head as unusable old habit, and then he'd stopped himself and hauled a load out to the ranch and asked her plain whether her method would read them true. She tried them. She had learned by then that the salt-and-soak fix didn't just close the drought-checked grain, it firmed the whole grain layer, and a hide with a third of its face damaged still had two-thirds sound, and the two-thirds, tanned true, made harness and skirting and strap that a saddle man would pay for and never see the difference. She could work a hide that any other house on the continent called scrap. She paid Harlan pennies for them at the dock, because that's what they cost, and she sold the leather for dollars, and the gap between the pennies and the dollars was the whole business, and it was made entirely out of the difference between what a hide was and what a man believed it was. 1989 was the year that broke the county. You know what 18% interest did to operations that had borrowed to expand in the late 70s and were still carrying the paper into the dry years? It called them. The bank in town posted the foreclosure notices on the courthouse board, and they came so thick that spring that the auctioneer couldn't work them all, and half the ranches Alara had grown up driving past went to sale, cattle and ground and equipment, and the good name of families that had held that grass 3 generations. Men who'd laughed easy at the feed store 2 years back were signing over deeds. The dry year had thinned the herds and the interest killed what the drought had left, because you cannot service 18% on a herd that's half dead, and every one of them had borrowed to grow. Vance Hide Works did not owe $1. It had been built out of $84 and a quarter book and a run of hides that everyone had called worthless, and the $70,000 had gone into a fleshing machine and 2 vats and Harlan's wage, all of it cash, all of it receipted, none of it borrowed. So when 18% came through the county like the drought had come the year before, it went right past the granary with the name painted on it, because there was nothing there to call. Year 2, the ledger closed at $24,000, clean, in the middle of the worst farm year the county had seen in 50, while men who'd been rich on paper the summer of the laugh were loading their households into pickups. Warren Vance stood in the granary one evening late that summer, looking at the new vats and the fleshing machine and the stacks of tanned, damaged hides drying that no other outfit on earth would have bought, and he had his brass pocket watch out of his shirt pocket, turning it over in his hand the way he did when he was working something through. His daughter was fixing to run a load, sleeves up, the crescent birthmark on her wrist showing. He watched her a while, then he put the watch away and said it. "You were right." 3 words from him too. He did not say more than Harlan had. He did not need to. He'd told her back in the dark of August that the ledger showed a profit if one of them said yes, and one had, and now he stood in the middle of the proof and squared the account the only honest way a careful man can, by naming it. It cost him nothing, because he had never wanted anything but the proof, and here it was in vats and receipts and a bank balance that 18% could not touch. She heard him and did not stop working. She just said, "Ledger's balanced," which was the only answer that meant anything to either of them, and Warren Vance nodded once in the steam and went out to check the 111 head, which had grown that year to 140. The years after '89 were not fast years. There is no fast in this. There is only the ledger closing a little higher each December than the December before, and a person spending against it carefully, the way a person spends money they've been taught they might lose. By year 3 the 2 vats in the granary corner were the bottleneck, hides drying in the rafters faster than the space could hold, and Alara made the first building decision of her life. She built a tannery shed, not a fine one, a working one 40 feet by 60 off the north side of the barn where the fence had gone down in the drought. The lumber came to $1,200, and she got the receipt. The labor, 2 men from the county who'd lost their own places and needed the work and knew how to raise a wall true, came to $800, and she got that receipt too, and paid it in cash, because she paid everything in cash, and she wrote lumber $1,200 and labor $800 into the ledger under year 3, and the shed went up over 4 weeks in the fall, and the vats moved into it, and the granary went back to being a granary. It was in the new shed that she learned the last real piece of the science, the piece the quarter book had gestured at but never quite handed her. She'd been running her Sultan soak by feel and by the 3.1 number, and it worked, but it worked unevenly on the badly damaged hides, some batches setting harder than others for no reason she could name, and it nagged at her the way an unexplained thing nagged at her father. She got a pH meter, a cheap one, mail order, $11 and change, and she started testing the soak liquor before she ran a hide, and she found it. The salt bath's acidity drifted as it worked, and a bath that had run 3 hides was a different thing than a fresh bath, more acid, and past a certain point the acid was what firmed some batches too hard and left the check open in others. She wanted the liquor held in a narrow band, mildly acid, no drift, and once she knew the number she could hold it, testing and correcting between runs, a splash of this or that to bring it back, and the unevenness went away. Every hide read true after that, drought checked or brand blotched or 30% scarred, because the chemistry was held steady where before it had been left to wander. She wrote the pH band in the notebook next to the 3.1, and it was hers and no books, the same as the salt number. And it was Harlan again who found her the next thing that was free because everyone had stopped seeing it. He was driving hides back from Omaha, from the big packing operation there, and he came through the industrial edge of the city and past a leather goods plant, one of the big ones that stamped out belts and cases by the thousand, and behind it in a fenced yard were dumpsters of offcuts. Irregular pieces, corners and curves, and the ragged edges trimmed off before the die stamped the regular shapes, Tannery finished leather already, good grain, already tanned and thrown away because it was the wrong shape and there was too much of it to sort. The plant was paying a hauler to take it to the landfill, Harlan asked. He was a buyer, it was in his nature to ask what a thing cost, and the plant manager laughed, not cruel, and said if Harlan wanted to haul the offcuts he could have them, that it'd save the plant the hauling fee, and did he want it in writing that they'd pay nothing. Harlan took it in writing. Free leather already tanned, tannery grade, that a man had been paying to bury. Alara could not make harness from an offcut. But she could make small goods, and small goods were where the margin was highest, and the offcuts came in by the truckload for the cost of the diesel to haul them, and she cut them into wallets and knife sheaths and dog collars and belt blanks, and every one was made of leather that had cost her nothing but a man's willingness to ask. The offcut line was pure margin on top of the hide business, and it grew fast, and by year 5 the ledger closed at $120,000, and the tannery shed had been added onto twice, and there were 4 people on wage, and Harlan ran the buying across 5 counties now and hauled Omaha offcuts on the way home. It was in year 5 that the first offer came to buy her out. A leather goods company out of the East, a real one, had heard about the drought hide method and the offcut line and the margins, and they sent a man in a suit who sat at her kitchen table where her father had read her ledger in the dark, and he laid a number on the table the way she had once laid numbers on that same table for Warren to read. $500,000. For the name, the method, the notebook, the offcut contracts, all of it, and they'd keep her on as a consultant if she liked, and she could walk away from a hard life with $500,000 in a county where men had just lost everything to 18%. She read the number the way her father read numbers, slowly, and then she asked the man one question, which was what they meant to do with the method after they had it, and he told her plainly enough that they'd move it east near the plants, scale it up, run it industrial. And she thought about the granary with her name painted on it in her own hand, and the tannery shed the county men had raised true, and Harlan out reading hides across 5 counties, and the 140 head grown back on the north grass, and she thought about the last honest thing, which was that a business built out of nothing that you owned free could not be taken from you, and $500,000 in the bank was a thing a bank could touch, and a market could have, and an 18% could call. She said no, she said it plainly the way she said everything. It's not for sale. And the man asked if she'd take 6, meaning 600,000, and she said no again, the same 3 words, and he understood that the second no meant the number wasn't the thing, and he capped his pen and thanked her for the coffee and drove off east. She wrote nothing in the ledger about the offer because a thing not taken is not a transaction, but she sat with it a while after he'd gone, alone at the kitchen table, and what came to her was Warren's own words, the philosophy he'd taught her not by saying it but by living it every year of her life. Ledger balanced, risk managed. The 500,000 would have unbalanced nothing on paper. It would have put a great number in the bank. But it would have handed the one thing she owned free and clear to men who'd owe on it, and the risk they carried was not her risk. And the day their market turned, the method would be exposed to a debt it had never been built to carry. She'd kept the business alive through the worst farm year in 50 by owing no one anything. She was not going to sell that for a number, however large, because the number was weather and the free and clear was ground. The years kept closing higher. By the early 90s, the business had outgrown the county's willingness to call it a hobby, though the county was slow to say so out loud, the way a county is. What changed it was outside eyes. In October of 1993, a writer from a trade magazine, Rural Innovator, drove out the ranch road in a rented car, notebook on the seat, having heard from a leather man back east about a woman in Nebraska who bought hides no one else would touch and turned them true. He spent 2 days at the ranch. He watched Alara test the soak liquor with the cheap pH meter and fold a 30% damaged hide at 90 in front of him and not find the check. And he watched Harlan grade a load off the truck. And he sat at the kitchen table and read the notebook with the salt number and the pH band in her plain hand. And he went home and wrote it up. And the piece ran under a headline she did not choose and never much liked. The Hide Alchemist. It made her sound like she'd done something with magic instead of with a quarter book and 2 years of evenings, and a salt ratio she'd found by ruining 9 hides and paying attention. But it ran, and it went out to every leather goods maker and saddlery and harness house on the magazine's list, and the phone in the kitchen did not stop. Orders came in that quarter at 3 times what they'd been, a surge she was not ready for and had to scramble to fill, hiring 2 more and running the tannery shed near around the clock through the winter of 93, and it settled after, not back down to where it had been but up onto a new shelf. By 1995, the shed was running 500 hides a month, steady, a number that would have been unimaginable to the girl who'd folded her first true hide at 90 in the granary 6 winters before, and the offcut line ran alongside it. And there were 8 people on wage now and a real office in the corner of the shed with the ledger in a fireproof box because Harlan had insisted. Year 10, the ledger closed at $300,000, and it closed clean, no debt. Every dollar receipted going out the same as coming in, the way it had since the parcel post window and the 4275. Alara had stopped doing all the buying and much of the grading herself by then, not because she couldn't but because there was too much of it, and she'd taught Harlan her standards, which were exacter than any he'd carried across the parts counter in 19 years. She taught him the fold at 90 and the wet flex and the grain integrity test, and how to read a 30% damaged hide for the 2/3 that was sound. And she taught him her pH band, and she trusted him to grade a load and price it and pay it and not get taken, because he was a man who'd been wrong once about one number and had spent the years since being right about all the rest. He'd been the first to say I was wrong and the first to be hired and the first to bring her the damaged hides and the Omaha offcuts, and now he was the one she trusted to hold the quality where she'd set it, and there was no one in the trade she'd have trusted more. Her father was slowing by then. He was into his 60s, and the ranch work that had kept him military straight all his life had started to bend him, and there were mornings he did not go out to the cattle as early as he once had, and Alara noticed and said nothing, because he would have hated the noticing said out loud. He still came to the shed. He still stood in the steam with his brass watch out, turning it over, watching the vats, and once in a while he'd catch some small thing gone slack, a bath run 1 hide too long, a receipt not written, and he'd name it quiet the way he named everything and it would get fixed. He was a careful man to the end of his strength, and his carefulness was in every corner of the business his daughter had built, in the receipt for every dollar and the ledger balanced clean, and the risk managed and never once gambled. And though he never worked a hide himself, the whole thing stood on the way of seeing he had taught her without ever once sitting her down to teach it. She knew he would not be in the shed forever. She did not say that out loud either. He went into 2001 still coming to the shed some mornings, and by the fall of that year he could not, and by the early winter it was clear to both of them the way such things become clear, without either of them needing to say the word. He kept the ledger by his bed those last weeks, not because there was accounting to do but because he liked it near, and Alara sat with him in the evenings when the shed had shut and told him the days numbers the way you'd tell a man the weather he could no longer go out into. And he listened, and nodded, and once in a while corrected a figure she'd rounded, because even then he would not have a small lie in the ledger. On one of those last evenings he had her bring the brass pocket watch from where it sat on the dresser, the one he'd carried in his shirt pocket her whole life and turned over in his hand every time he'd had a thing to work through, and he put it in her hand and closed her fingers over it, the crescent birthmark on her wrist showing in the lamplight, and he did not make a speech of it, because he had never made a speech of anything. He just gave her the watch, And then he told her the last thing, 4 words, the thing that was the whole of everything he had ever taught her folded down to what would fit in the time he had left. Keep the ledger balanced. He died that winter in the house he had never had to sell, on ground he had owned free and clear to the last day of his life. And Alara Vance buried her father and came back to the ranch and to the shed with his brass watch in her own shirt pocket now. And she kept it there. And she turned it over in her hand when she had a thing to work through. The same as he had, and the workshop that had been his was hers now. The tools and the way of seeing both, and she used them daily. The business did not stop for the grief, because a business built on hides and steady work does not stop for anything, and she did not let it because he would not have. She had learned by then that the frontier of the thing was never in the drought hides alone. It was in whatever the trade was throwing away that a person could learn to read true, and there was always something. That year it was horse collar offcuts. A saddlery 2 states over that made harness and collars by hand had a back room piled with the offcuts of the heaviest, best leather in the trade, collar weight, thick and dense, and trimmed to nothing usable by their patterns, and they were paying, same as the Omaha plant had, to have it hauled off. She got it for the diesel. Collar weight leather cut down into knife sheaths and heavy strap, and the kind of small goods that a man paid the most for and expected to hand down to his children, all of it out of a saddlery's burn pile. By year 15, the ledger closed at $850,000. Clean, no debt, receipt for every dollar. And there were near 20 people on wage and 3 tannery sheds now, and a hide-buying network that Harlan ran across half the state. And the offcut lines came in from Omaha and the saddlery, and 2 more plants that had heard there was a woman in Cherry County who'd take what they were paying to bury. And every dollar of it traced back, if you followed the ledger far enough, to a quarter spent on a book at a farm auction and 2 years of evenings, and a girl who had looked at 640 dead cattle in the draws and seen, where everyone else saw ruin, a material that had already been grown and worked and proven, and was free only because they'd all stopped looking at it. She kept her father's journals in the workshop, and she wrote in them now, in her own hand alongside his, because she'd come to understand a thing she wanted set down where the next person could find it. The salt number and the pH band and the fold at 90 were hers, but they would be no one's if they died with her, and she'd learned everything she knew from a dead man's book. So she wrote it all down, plain and complete, the soak times and the salt ratios and the way to read a 30% damaged hide for its sound 2/3, the way she'd want it written if she were the one coming after with everything to learn and no one left to ask. Preparation meets opportunity, her father used to say, not as a lesson but as a plain fact about how the world worked, that the drought did not make her, the 2 years of evenings before the drought made her, and the drought only asked the question that her preparation could answer. So she prepared the ones who'd come after the only way she knew, by writing it all down in the journals in the workshop that had been his and was hers, in the lamplight with the brass watch in her shirt pocket, closing each entry the way he'd taught her. The ledger balanced, the risk managed, nothing rounded, nothing gambled, every dollar receipted, every hide read true. She was writing in those journals on a July morning in 2023, when a car she did not recognize came up the ranch road. A small hybrid thing with a college parking sticker in the corner of the windshield, and it stopped in the gravel where a truck usually stopped. And a young woman got out of it holding a notebook against her chest, the way you'd hold a thing you didn't want the wind to take. 24 years old, dark hair cut short, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she stood a moment looking at the sheds and the vats and the granary with Alara's name still on it in her own faded hand. And then she came across the lot toward the tannery shed where Alara stood in the doorway with the brass watch out, turning it over, the way her father had stood in doorways her whole life. The young woman was Maya, Warren's brother's granddaughter, which made her Alara's niece by the long reckoning of ranch families, and Alara had met her twice, once as a small girl and once at Warren's funeral where she'd been a teenager standing at the back. And she was at the agricultural college now, in her last year, studying something Alara only half understood from the letters that came at Christmas. By then the business was a thing that took some understanding. 5,000 hides a year came through the sheds, and the ledger for the year just closed had read $2.1 million, clean, no debt, receipt for every dollar, and there were near 30 people on wage across the tannery and the buying network and the offcut lines. It had grown past anything the girl in the granary could have pictured, and it had grown the way water grows on flat ground, steadily, in every direction at once, and never once by borrowing. Maya came into the shed and stood in the steam and looked at the vats a long while before she said what she'd come to say. Then she opened the notebook. Alara knew the notebook. Not this one, but its kind, the cheap kind a whole plan lived in, and she recognized the way Maya held it and the way she'd filled it, and something in her went quiet and attentive the way her father's face had gone quiet and attentive over a ledger at a kitchen table 35 years before. Maya's idea was the offcuts. Not the way Alara used the offcuts, cut into wallets and sheaths and belt blanks, but the scrap of the offcuts, the shavings and the split-side waste and the dust that came off the cutting tables even after Alara had taken the good pieces, the last leavings of a thing that was already the leavings of something else. There was a great deal of it. Every tannery shed threw off a bin of it a week, leather too small and too fibrous to cut into anything, and it went at present into the burn pile or the county landfill, and Alara paid to have it hauled. Maya wanted to make packaging from it. She said it plainly, the way the family said things. Leather scrap broken down was collagen and fiber could be pulped, wetted and beaten and screened the way paper was made, and cast into sheets, and the sheets would be stiff and strong, and this was the word she used, biodegradable, meaning it would rot back into the ground the way a hide would if you buried it, instead of sitting in a landfill for 100 years, the way the plastic and foam packaging did that every leather goods maker in the country wrapped their product in to ship it. A wallet made of leather, Maya said, and shipped in a box lined with foam that would outlast the wallet by a century. There was something wrong in that, and she'd looked at it, and she thought the fix was already sitting in Alara's burn pile. Alara listened, and she did not say yes. She did not say no either. What she said, after a while, turning the watch over, was that she needed to understand the process before she could think about anything else, and she asked Maya to walk her through it, and Maya did, and it was clear from the first minutes that the girl had done the work. The leather pulp method was not simple. Leather was not paper. It had been tanned, which meant its fibers had been chemically fixed to resist rotting, the exact opposite of what you wanted for something meant to break down. And so the first problem was undoing part of the tanning, opening the fiber back up, and Maya had a method for it, a controlled treatment that softened the fixed collagen without dissolving it. So the fiber would pulp and bind but still, once cast and dried, sit stable until you buried it or wetted it hard. She had the treatment times. She had the temperatures. She had the beating schedule, how long to work the pulp to get fiber that would mat into a sheet with strength across the grain and not just along it, and she had the screening and the pressing and the drying, and she had numbers on all of it. She had done it in a university lab. That was the thing that turned Alara's attention from courtesy to something harder and more interested. Maya had run the process in the college's materials lab, small batches, and she had the test results in the back of the notebook, and she turned to them and laid the notebook flat on the workbench in the steam. Tier strength, burst strength. The load a sheet would carry before it failed, and the moisture it would take before it went soft, and a burial test where she'd put cast sheets in soil and pulled them at intervals to weigh what was left, and the sheets were gone, near enough, in 90 days. Alara read the numbers the way she read everything, slowly. She had ruined 9 hides to find her own numbers. She knew what it cost to get a number that held, and she knew a real one from a hopeful one, and these were real. The girl had beaten the pulp too long in one early batch and gotten a sheet that curled, and she'd written that down too, the failure with the fix beside it, the beating schedule shortened, and it was the failure written down honestly that told Alara more than any of the successes. Maya had not arrived already knowing. She had learned it in the lab the way Alara had learned hers in the granary, by getting it wrong and paying attention. Alara turned the last page. There was nothing after the burial test but a blank sheet, and Maya had come to the end of what a college lab could give her, which was proof the thing worked at the size of a dinner plate, and no way at all to know whether it worked at the size of a business. She'd driven out the ranch road holding her notebook against her chest to find out. The startup ledger Maya had brought was on the page before the test results, and Alara turned back to it because she'd known before she looked that it would be there, because the girl was family and had the family's way of putting the numbers before the dream. It was headed, in Maya's hand, Biopack. Startup. And under it, itemized, was every dollar it would take to move the thing out of a college lab and into the granary and prove it at a size that meant something. Alara read it line by line the way her father had read hers at the kitchen table in the dark, and she did not skip a line, and she did not round anything, and when she got to the bottom she read the total, which Maya had written out plain and not made prettier than it was. $1,842.30. That was the whole of it. To start a division of a $3 million business on $1,800 because the material was free, the way the Drought hides had been free, the way the Omaha offcuts had been free, because it was a thing everyone else was paying to bury. Alara looked at the number a while. Then she said the thing her father had said to her, only she said the front half of it and not the back. "Show me the numbers." And Maya, who did not know she was being answered in a language 35 years old, said the numbers were right there, and started to explain the 1842-30, the equipment and the materials, and Alara let her, because she wanted to hear how the girl accounted for it, wanted to know if every dollar had a reason and a receipt behind it or would have. The equipment came to $1,200, a beater, second-hand, out of a defunct paper craft operation, $400, a screening and pressing rig Maya meant to build herself from plans, the frames and the mesh and the hardware, $300, a drying rack, second-hand, $100. A vat for the fiber opening treatment and the chemistry to charge it, $400. $1,200 for the whole of the equipment, and Maya had priced every piece and had a source for every piece and had the receipt already, in some cases, folded into the back of the notebook. The materials came to $642.30. That was the fiber opening chemistry for the first real runs, and the binding agent and screening cloth, and the testing supplies to check each batch the way it would need checking, and the odd cost of a proper scale, because Maya had learned, the way Alara had learned with salt, that a thing you measured by feel would betray you and a thing you weighed would not. $1,206.42.30, $1,842.30, and the material free, and the granary sitting empty and clean where the whole business had started. Alara said yes. She said it the moment Maya finished the last line of the ledger, before the girl had even closed the notebook. And Maya looked up startled because she'd braced herself to argue, had driven out expecting to be told to come back in a year with more proof, the way the college had told her, and the way any careful business person would tell her. And instead her aunt had said yes with the ink barely dry on the total. There was no permission to seek, and Alara sought none, and she granted it the way it had once been granted to her, except she granted it faster, because she had spent 5 days once waiting on a granting and had learned in that waiting exactly what a yes was worth when the numbers were sound. Her father had needed the 5 days because he'd been managing a risk to the whole ranch. Maya's 1842-30 put nothing at risk that mattered. It bought equipment that could be resold and materials that would be used up, proving a thing one way or the other. And the material itself was the burn pile scrap Alara was paying to haul off, and the granary was standing empty, and the girl had done the work in the lab and written down her failures honestly and put the ledger before the dream. There was nothing to think about that Maya had not already thought about and written down, so Alara did not make her wait. She had waited once, at this same kind of table, holding her breath through 5 days, and she remembered the shape of that waiting, and she had promised herself something in it without knowing she'd promised it, which was that if a person ever came to her with sound numbers and a thing everyone else had stopped seeing, she would not make them hold their breath. "Yes," she said, and then, because Maya still looked as though she might not have heard right, she said it again the plain way, set up in the granary. Alara had once had to wait for permission. She gave hers immediately. They set up in the granary that fall. Maya moved the beater and the treatment vat and the drying rack into the same clapboard building where Alara had ruined 9 hides in the winter of '88. And she built her screening and pressing rig herself from the plans, at the same workbench where Alara had built her first vats, and the granary that had gone back to being a granary, and then had watched a whole business be born out of it and leave it became, once more, the place where a new thing got tried first. The first test batch did not work. Maya beat the pulp to her lab schedule and screened a sheet and pressed it and dried it, and it came off the rack curled and weak, tearing under its own weight when she lifted it, and she stood in the granary with the ruined sheet in her hands the way Alara had stood there with brittle hides 35 years before. But she'd written the lab failures down, and she knew this one, or thought she did, and she went to the notebook. The lab had a controlled room, the granary did not. The fiber opening treatment ran by temperature, and the college lab had held the temperature steady at a bench, and the granary in the Nebraska fall did not hold anything steady, cold in the morning and warm by afternoon, and the treatment that had opened the fiber just right at a lab bench was over-opening it in the warm hours and under-opening it in the cold, and the pulp beat unevenly off it, and the sheet came out weak. It was the same lesson Alara had learned with the pH meter, that a thing left to wander would betray you, and a thing held would not, and Maya diagnosed it in a day and fixed it with a cheap thermometer and a schedule keyed to the granary's own temperature instead of the lab's, treating longer in the cold and shorter in the warm to land the fiber in the same narrow band, whatever the day was doing. The next batch came off the rack flat and strong. She lifted a sheet by one corner and it held its own weight and more, and she pressed her thumb into it and it did not tear, and she flexed it and it did not crack. And it was the first packaging sheet made of Cherry County burn pile scrap that would carry a load and then rot back into the ground in 90 days. And she'd made it in a granary for a cost that was already written down to the dime. By 2026, Vance Hide Works and Biopack together employed 32 people. 15,000 hides a year came through the Tannery sheds now, and the two divisions closed the year at $3.8 million. Clean, no debt, receipt for every dollar out the same as in. The way it had been since a girl carried a package to the parcel post window and paid $42.75 and got the receipt. Maya ran Biopack out of the granary and two sheds built beside it, turning out 200 packaging units a month and climbing, casting the burn pile scrap of a leather business into the boxes and liners that a growing list of leather goods makers now used to ship the very products the scrap had come from. A wallet made of leather, shipped in a box made of the same leather's leavings, and both of them able to go back into the ground when their long lives were done. Alara turned 66 that year, and she still came to the sheds most mornings with the brass watch in her shirt pocket, turning it over when she had a thing to work through. She had painted her name on the granary once in her own hand, when a parts man named Harlan Briggs had laughed at her in a gravel lot, though Harlan had stopped laughing in 1989, and had spent the rest of his working life reading hides for her across half the state, and had retired at last only 2 years back, and she'd hired his standards along with his hands and they were in the business still. Warren had never worked a hide, but the ledger was balanced clean 38 years running because of a way of seeing he'd taught his daughter without once sitting her down to teach it. And a girl had come up the ranch road holding a notebook against her chest and had seen, in a burn pile everyone was paying to be rid of, a material that was already collagen and fiber and only free because they'd all stopped looking at it. The difference between scrap and a material had never been in the thing. It had only ever been in who was looking at it, and whether they'd prepared themselves to see. That was the whole of what Warren taught, and what Alara taught after him, and what Maya had come already carrying without knowing where she'd got it. And it was written down now in the workshop journals in 3 hands, plain and complete, for whoever came up the ranch road next with a notebook and a thing everyone else had thrown away. As of August of 2026, the granary still stands. The name is still on it. The ledger still balances and it still owes no one anything, and this story isn't over, not even close. She planted a business in a drought-stricken range. They called it a hobby. The drought came, the cattle died, the business lived. The magazine writer came out in the spring of 2000, drove the ranch road in a rented car, and left 3 days later with a notebook full and a photograph of a woman standing in a tannery doorway with a brass watch in her hand. And the piece ran that summer and brought the buyers and the makers and the occasional college student, and Warren read it at the kitchen table with his glasses down his nose, and said only that they'd spelled Cherry County right, which from him was near a standing ovation. He was 78 that year, and the years had begun to take him the way they take a body that has worked outdoors its whole life, slowly and then not slowly. His hands, which had turned a pocket watch over 1,000 times in 1,000 doorways, had begun to shake at rest, and the walk from the house to the sheds that he had made every morning of Alara's business took him longer each season, and he stopped making it in the winter of 2000, and then he stopped making it at all. He died at home in the March of 2001, in the room he'd slept in for 50 years with Alara beside the bed. He had not been a man for speeches, and he did not make one at the end. He reached into the pocket of the shirt she'd helped him into that morning, the red and black plaid gone soft with washing, and he took out the brass watch and put it in her hand and closed her fingers over it. Then he said the only instruction he had left to give: keep the ledger balanced. 3 words and no decoration, the same 3 words he might have said about a fence or a feed bill, and then he closed his eyes, and later that day he was gone. Alara buried him beside her mother in the little cemetery on the county road, and she came back to the sheds the next morning with the brass watch in her shirt pocket, because there was nothing else to do with grief in that family but carry it out to the work. There was no permission left to seek from anyone, and Alara had not sought any in years, but she felt the difference of it now, the door of the house standing open onto rooms where no one was thinking her plans over for 5 days. She had become, without noticing the moment it happened, the careful person at the head of the table. And she kept the ledger balanced. The business by then had outgrown Drought hides long since. Alara had gone looking, the way she'd learned to look, for the next thing the world was paying to be rid of, and she'd found it in the saddleries. Horse collars and harness were cut from heavy hide, and the cutting threw off a curved offcut, the belly and the neck pieces too irregular for a straight strap, and the saddleries bailed it and paid to have it hauled the same as the tanneries had bailed their splits. Alara took it for the cost of the hauling, which was to say for nothing, and her sheds cut it into the small strong things that irregular heavy leather was perfect for: knife sheaths and belt keepers and the reinforced corners of bags, and it was another free material that everyone else had stopped seeing because they'd already decided what it was. By the 15th year, the year Warren died, the ledger for the year closed at $850,000, clean, no debt, receipt for every dollar out the same as in. It had grown the way water grows on flat ground, in every direction at once and never by borrowing, and it had grown because a girl in a granary had understood a thing her father taught her without teaching, which was that preparation is only patience with a purpose, and that opportunity, when it comes disguised as the thing everyone else is throwing away. She began that year to write it all down. Warren's workshop journals sat on the shelf above the bench, a stack of them, cheap bound books he'd filled over 50 years with fence lines and calving dates and the small daily arithmetic of a ranch, his own square hand slanting across the pages, and Alara took the next blank one down and began in the evenings to set down the method. The salt ratios, the soak times, the way a hide told you it was ready by the way it bent, the pH and the temperature and the failures, all of them, written down honest beside their fixes the way she'd learned they had to be, because a method that hid its failures taught nobody anything. She wrote in the same journals Warren had written in, her hand under his hand on the shelf, and she did not know yet who she was writing it for. She kept documenting for 22 years. The journals filled and she started fresh ones, and the method that had lived in her head and in one cheap notebook came to live on the shelf above the bench in a form that a stranger could follow, and she came to think of that as its own kind of ledger, a balance kept against the day the knowledge would be needed, and the person who carried it would not be there to ask. Up to this point, the business had grown only outward, into new free materials and new sheds and new hands on the wage line. That was about to change direction entirely. It was 2023, and Alara was 63, when the rented car came up the ranch road again, though this one was smaller and older and driven by a young woman who parked it careful at the edge of the lot and sat a moment before she got out. 24 years old, dark hair cut short, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she stood a moment looking at the sheds and the vats and the granary with Alara's name still on it in her own faded hand. And then she came across the lot toward the tannery shed where Alara stood in the doorway with the brass watch out, turning it over, the way her father had stood in doorways her whole life. The young woman was Maya, Warren's brother's granddaughter, which made her Alara's niece by the long reckoning of ranch families, and Alara had met her twice, once as a small girl and once at Warren's funeral where she'd been a teenager standing at the back. And she was at the agricultural college now, in her last year, studying something Alara only half understood from the letters that came at Christmas. By then the business was a thing that took some understanding. 5,000 hides a year came through the sheds, and the ledger for the year just closed had read $2.1 million, clean, no debt, receipt for every dollar, and there were near 30 people on wage across the tannery and the buying network and the off-cut lines. It had grown past anything the girl in the granary could have pictured, and it had grown the way water grows on flat ground, steadily, in every direction at once, and never once by borrowing. Maya came into the shed and stood in the steam and looked at the vats a long while before she said what she'd come to say. Then she opened the notebook. Alara knew the notebook. Not this one, but its kind, the cheap kind a whole plan lived in, and she recognized the way Maya held it and the way she'd filled it, and something in her went quiet and attentive the way her father's face had gone quiet and attentive over a ledger at a kitchen table 35 years before. Maya's idea was the offcuts. Not the way Alara used the offcuts, cut into wallets and sheaths and belt blanks, but the scrap of the offcuts, the shavings and the split-side waste and the dust that came off the cutting tables even after Alara had taken the good pieces, the last leavings of a thing that was already the leavings of something else. There was a great deal of it. Every tannery shed threw off a bin of it a week, leather too small and too fibrous to cut into anything, and it went at present into the burn pile or the county landfill, and Alara paid to have it hauled. Maya wanted to make packaging from it. She said it plainly, the way the family said things. Leather scrap broken down was collagen and fiber could be pulped, wetted and beaten and screened the way paper was made, and cast into sheets, and the sheets would be stiff and strong and biodegradable, meaning it would rot back into the ground the way a hide would if you buried it, instead of sitting in a landfill for 100 years, the way the plastic and foam packaging did that every leather goods maker in the country wrapped their product in to ship it. Alara listened, and she did not say yes. She did not say no either. She heard in her own caution the shape of her father's 5 days, the careful person weighing a thing before she moved on it, and she recognized it and let it work. The process was not simple. Leather had been tanned, its fibers chemically fixed to resist rotting, the exact opposite of what you wanted for a thing meant to break down. And so the first problem was undoing part of the tanning without dissolving it. And Alara wanted to understand that before she thought about anything else, and she asked Maya to walk her through it. The girl had done the work. She had a treatment for opening the fiber back up, temperatures and times, and a beating schedule to mat the fiber across the grain and not just along it, and a screening and pressing and drying, and she had run it, small batches, in the college's materials lab, and she had the test results in the back of the notebook. Tear strength, burst strength, a burial test where cast sheets went into soil and came out at 90 days near enough gone, and a failure written down honest beside its fix, a batch beaten too long that curled, the schedule shortened after. Maya had not arrived already knowing. She had learned it in a lab the way Alara had learned hers in a granary, by getting it wrong and paying attention, and she'd driven out the ranch road holding her notebook against her chest to find out whether a thing that worked at the size of a dinner plate would work at the size of a business. She had asked one thing before she said anything else, the same thing her father had asked her across the kitchen table 35 years back. "Show me the numbers." Maya turned to the last page of the notebook, the cost ledger, and laid it in front of her. Equipment, $1,200, a beater and a press and screens she could build and resell. Materials, $642.30, treatment chemicals and rod and the like, used up in the proving one way or the other. $1,842.30 total at the bottom, and it put nothing at risk that could not be walked back, and the material was scrap Alara was already paying to be rid of. That was the thing Alara had been waiting to see, and it was there, plain and honest, failures written down beside their fixes. So she said the second thing, and she said it without the 5 days. Yes. Maya blinked, and Alara said it the plain way, set up in the granary, and the girl who had come up the ranch road holding a notebook against her chest let out the breath she had been holding since the parking lot. The name is still on that granary in a hand gone faded now, and the ledger for 2026 closed at $3.8 million across the 2 divisions. Clean, no debt, 32 people on the wage line, and a receipt for every dollar out the same as in. 15,000 hides a year came through the sheds. Maya ran Biopack out of the granary and the 2 sheds beside it, turning out 200 packaging units a month and climbing, casting the last leavings of a leather business into the boxes the leather itself would ship home in. A wallet made of leather, mailed in a box made of that leather's dust, and both of them able to go back into the ground when their long lives were spent. Alara turned 66 that year, and she still came to the sheds most mornings with the brass watch in her shirt pocket, turning it over when she had a thing to work through. Warren had put it in her hand in the March of 2001 and closed her fingers over it, and the last instruction he had left to give was 3 words with no decoration: keep the ledger balanced. She had 38 years running, and the difference between scrap and a material had never once been in the thing. It had lived the whole time in who was looking at it, and whether they had prepared themselves to see, and that was written down now in the workshop journals in 3 hands, plain and complete, for whoever came up the ranch road next with a notebook and a thing everyone else had thrown away. As of August of 2026, the granary still stands. The name is still on it. The ledger still balances, and it owes no one anything, and this story isn't over, not even close. She planted a business in a drought-stricken range. They called it a hobby. The drought came, the cattle died, the business lived.